A People's Perspective, Adding Capabilities to the Poverty Puzzle by Caroline Holliday and Ryan Hodgson. Let's start with the big question. What is poverty? Here's what some W&L students and faculty think.
What is poverty? Poverty is just think about it. Okay, poverty, the definition of people living below the poverty line is those who live on less than, I think it's $1.23 per day in America. Poverty.
It is when people are lacking in resources.
What is poverty?
Deprivation.
There seems to be a broad range of ideas as to what poverty really is. We want to try and bring some clarity to the question. We are trying to explain how poverty should be defined and measured. The only way to really be able to measure poverty is to first understand what it is. Poverty is a lack of sufficient financial and economic resources to attain the capabilities that lead to a dignified human life. Therefore, poverty should be measured using the Supplemental Poverty Measure with the addition of the Human Development Index to account for capabilities. When asked what words come to mind when considering poverty, these are some of the things that W&L students thought about. Hunger, lack of money, lack of resources, lack of education, hardship, lack of shelter, third world, and single parents.
Today, most people tend to look at poverty from an income perspective. Let's look at a scenario to make this more clear. The line in the middle represents the poverty line for a certain society, which in this case is $3. The man on the top would not be defined as poor because he has $4, while the woman on the bottom would be in poverty because she only has $2. It is important to note that the only factor in determining poverty here is cash income. Seems pretty simple, right? Let's look at another scenario. Scenario number 2. All of the factors are the same here, except now we know that the man on top has significant medical expenses, taking $2 away from his normal income. Let's see how this changes his poverty status. Looking at this one additional expense has moved the man below the poverty line. His income is no longer sufficient to support his needs. Now that we've considered other factors outside of income, what else is there to consider? Let's go back to our original ideas about poverty. There is much more to consider outside of income. As we said before, poverty is a lack of sufficient financial and economic resources to attain the capabilities that lead to a dignified human life. In other words, poverty is capabilities inadequacy. Now we know that may sound confusing, so let's look at what a capability actually is. According to Sen, a capability is the alternative combinations of functionings the person can achieve. Functionings are the things that one manages to do or be in leading a life. Let's take a look at a scenario to make the distinction between capabilities and functionings more clear. In this scenario, person 1 and person 2 are both starving. They essentially have the same functioning. However, if we look at each individual situation, person 1 lacks adequate food resources. Person 1 has no choice but to starve. Person 2, on the other hand, has all of this food available to him, but he chooses to fast. They have the same functioning because they are both starving. However, person 2 could choose not to starve, while person 1 has no other choice. Capabilities give you the freedom to choose. Without this freedom, one could be defined as poor. In other words, they have a capabilities inadequacy. Just so we all remember, poverty is defined as a lack of sufficient financial and economic resources to attain the capabilities that lead to a dignified human life.
So what are some of these capabilities? A few of the key ones include the capability to live a long and healthy life, the capability to use your senses, imagination, and thought, or the capability to reason practically. If a person does not have the financial and economic resources to attain these capabilities, then they should be defined as poor. Now that we've defined poverty, how can we actually measure it? Let's start by looking at how poverty is currently measured in the United States. The U.S. government currently uses the Official Poverty Measure, or the OPM. The OPM looks at resources a person or family has and relates that to a specific threshold. Molly Orshansky estimated that a family spends about 1/3 of its budget on food. So in 1963, she looked at the lowest cost food plan and multiplied that expense by 3 to cover other needs of the family, such as shelter, clothing, and utilities. This number was adjusted for family size and composition. Next, the OPM defines a family's package of resources. This includes gross annual cash income from all sources such as earnings, pensions, interest income, rental income, asset income, and cash welfare. It is important to note that the OPM is only looking at annual income. Therefore, a family is poor if their income falls below the threshold for a family of that size and composition. While the OPM is pretty easy to measure, there are some problems. The OPM is an absolute measure, meaning it doesn't change as standards of living do. There is much more that needs to be considered. The OPM doesn't consider things such as food stamps or childcare expenses. If we want to include factors like these that undoubtedly affect poverty, we must use a different measure. Another way to measure poverty is with the Supplemental Poverty Measure, also known as the SPM. Like the OPM, the SPM also considers a threshold and resource package. The SPM looks at 4 basic needs: food, clothing, shelter, and utilities. It then looks at how much money the entire population is spending on these FCSU needs and multiplies the expenses of the 33rd percentile household by 1.2. The threshold does not just account for family size, but it also adjusts for differing housing prices around the country. This threshold has the ability to move up and down as consumption patterns and needs change in the U.S. Resources. The SPM includes the same resources as the OPM, while additionally considering benefits such as food stamps and expenses such as taxes, childcare, and medical dues. As you can see, the SPM offers a much more comprehensive picture of an individual family's situation. However, what about all these capabilities we mentioned before? Does the SPM cover all of those? Poverty should be measured using the Supplemental Poverty Measure, in addition to the American Human Development Index. The Human Development Index allows us to incorporate a person's capabilities into the SPM. This includes a long and healthy life, access to knowledge, and, as our original definition calls for, the financial means to attain these capabilities. The threshold is now determined by the food, clothing, shelter, and utility needs as defined by the SPM, plus the capabilities as measured by the Human Development Index. By combining the SPM and HDI, we have a concrete way to measure poverty in our country with respect to capabilities.
This definition and measurement will allow us to move forward with addressing the issue of poverty in the United States.